It was just another ordinary flight, or so it seemed. The kind of flight where the hum of the airplane's engines lulls most passengers into a peaceful nap. But for one man aboard this first-class flight, the next few hours would unfold in a way he could never have imagined, leading to a moment of regret that would haunt him forever. As the plane began its journey across the sky, a man in his late 30s settled into his plush seat, the kind that only first-class travelers enjoy. He adjusted the seat, leaned back, and glanced around the cabin, his eyes catching on every luxury surrounding him. A quiet, confident man. He was used to the finer things in life. He worked hard for his success, and he felt entitled to a certain level of comfort. He looked the part: sharp suit, polished shoes, and a demeanor that suggested he didn't take nonsense from anyone. But today, he would face something that even his self-assurance couldn't prepare him for. At first, he didn't notice the man sitting across the aisle. It wasn't until the flight attendants were serving drinks that he caught sight of him. The man was wearing a simple gray hoodie and jeans, far from the expensive suits the first-class crowd usually wore. He was unassuming, almost blending into the background, which made him all the more intriguing. The man had a kind face, yet something about him seemed different. It was as if there was a quiet power radiating from him, a presence that didn't demand attention but still managed to draw it in. And that's when the whispers began. It started with a few curious glances from passengers, murmurs that only grew louder as people began to recognize him. The man in the hoodie wasn't just any ordinary traveler. He was none other than Keanu Reeves, the beloved actor who had captivated audiences around the world with his roles in The Matrix and John Wick. It was a moment of surprise for many passengers, and some couldn't resist taking out their phones to snap a quick photo. The man in the suit, let's call him Mark, noticed the growing buzz around him. At first, he was indifferent, dismissing it as nothing more than the usual fanfare surrounding celebrities. But as the whispers turned into excited chatter, he began to feel irritated. Why should someone like Keanu Reeves, a mere actor, be given so much attention on a flight like this? Mark couldn't help but roll his eyes. He had worked hard to get where he was, and here was this Hollywood star, effortlessly enjoying the same luxuries he had worked so hard to earn. That's when the snide comments began. Mark, in his usual manner of never holding back, leaned over to the flight attendant who was serving drinks nearby and remarked loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I don't get it. People idolize this guy like he's some kind of hero. Just a role. He's just pretending to be something he's not." The flight attendant looked awkwardly at him, unsure of how to respond. But Mark didn't stop there. He continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I mean, how much do you think the guy gets paid to pretend to be a badass? It's embarrassing how much people fawn over these actors. They're just playing make-believe, and here we are, treating them like gods." The other passengers around him stiffened. They glanced nervously at Keanu, who hadn't reacted, still sitting quietly. His eyes closed, seemingly lost in thought. Mark, oblivious to the discomfort he was causing, looked around the cabin and gave a small, smug smile. It was clear he believed his opinion was the truth. But what happened next would shake him to his core. Out of nowhere, Keanu spoke up. In his calm, almost serene voice, he addressed Mark without looking directly at him. "You think being an actor is all about pretending? You think it's easy to pretend to be someone else every single day?" Mark froze. The room became eerily quiet, every passenger turning their attention toward the exchange. Mark's smug expression faltered as he processed what Keanu had just said. There was no bitterness in his tone, no anger, only a quiet, thoughtful question. Keanu continued, "Maybe you're right, but it's not just about pretending. It's about understanding the human experience. It's about tapping into something real, something raw. And sometimes, it's the pretending that helps us understand who we truly are." Mark's face flushed. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Keanu Reeves. But before he could retort, Keanu's next words caught him completely off guard. "You want to know why I'm on this flight, Mark? I'm not here for the luxury or the attention. I'm here because, like everyone else, I'm just trying to get home to my family. And the funny thing is, I've never felt more real than when I'm just a person on a plane, sitting in a seat just like everyone else." Mark stared, mouth slightly open, as the weight of Keanu's words settled in. It wasn't just a response to his comment. It was an insight into a life that Mark had never truly considered. A life where fame and fortune didn't define a person. Where, behind the image the world had crafted, there was a human being just like everyone else, with struggles, emotions, and a deep connection to those he cared about. The silence in the cabin stretched for what felt like an eternity. Mark's mind raced. He had insulted Keanu, belittled him in front of the other passengers, and yet here Keanu was, showing more depth and humility in a single conversation than Mark had ever allowed himself to see in the world around him. But the twist was just beginning. As the plane soared higher, the atmosphere inside the cabin shifted. It was clear that Mark had no idea who he was really sitting next to. And soon the truth would be revealed, something even more unexpected than the quiet wisdom Keanu had just shared. Just as the captain's voice came over the loudspeaker, signaling that they were approaching their destination, Keanu's phone rang. He picked it up with a calm nod, but the conversation that followed would leave Mark, along with everyone else in the cabin, completely stunned. To be continued. Keanu's phone buzzed again, the sharp vibration breaking the tension that hung in the air. He glanced down at the screen, his face unreadable. Mark, still reeling from the unexpected confrontation, couldn't help but watch Keanu's reaction. There was something about the way he answered the call that made the entire cabin feel even more intimate, as though they were witnessing a moment of vulnerability, something that rarely happened in the public gaze of celebrities. Keanu's voice was low but steady as he spoke into the phone. "Yes, I'm on the plane. Just a couple more hours. I'll be there." His tone was calm, almost soothing, but there was an undercurrent of urgency in his words. Mark leaned forward just a bit, trying to catch the next part of the conversation, but Keanu, noticing the curiosity, shifted in his seat, subtly blocking Mark's view. The exchange was short, with Keanu ending the call with a quiet, "I'll see you soon." Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The conversation had felt out of place. It wasn't just the fact that Keanu had received a call mid-flight. It was the way he handled it, with a level of focus and composure that seemed almost too deliberate. He didn't seem like someone who was simply catching a flight. He seemed like someone with a purpose, someone who was involved in something bigger than just being a movie star. Something that wasn't immediately obvious, something Mark had no idea about. The man in the suit sat back in his seat, trying to push away the feeling of unease gnawing at him. He was used to being in control, used to being the one who had the upper hand in any situation. But right now he felt out of his element. The power dynamic between him and Keanu had shifted in a way he wasn't prepared for. It was like a game of chess, and Keanu had made the first move, but Mark had no idea what the next move would be. As the plane continued its journey, the cabin settled into a quieter rhythm. The flight attendants came around with their service, but the usual hum of casual conversation had died down. Everyone was now subtly watching Keanu, as though waiting for the next act in the drama that had unfolded so unexpectedly. Mark could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, and it made him uncomfortable. He was a man who prided himself on his reputation, someone who never backed down from a challenge. But this wasn't a challenge he had expected. This wasn't just about insults and public ego. It felt like something deeper was at play. Trying to shake the uncomfortable tension, Mark pulled out his phone, hoping to distract himself. But every time he glanced up, he found his eyes inevitably drawn to Keanu, who seemed lost in his own thoughts, staring out the window. There was a quiet power to him that Mark couldn't quite place, something magnetic that made it hard for him to look away. What was it about Keanu that made him stand out so much in a room full of rich, powerful people? Keanu, sensing the weight of Mark's gaze, turned his head slightly, meeting his eyes for the briefest moment. It was subtle, but it felt like an unspoken acknowledgement. Mark was still processing what had happened earlier, how easily Keanu had dismantled his smug comments with nothing more than a few calm, deliberate words. He had been expecting a confrontation, maybe even an argument, but instead, Keanu had given him a lesson in humility. But even that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was the strange sense of recognition Mark felt toward Keanu. It wasn't the kind of recognition that came from seeing someone famous in person. It was deeper. There was a feeling, almost a whisper in his mind, that he had crossed paths with this man before, though he couldn't place when or where. He shook his head, trying to push the thought away. Maybe it was just the weird tension of the moment getting to him. As the plane began its descent toward their destination, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, giving the standard announcement. Mark's thoughts drifted back to the strange phone call Keanu had received earlier. Who was he talking to? What was so important that it had caused such a shift in his demeanor? It was the kind of thing that didn't sit right with Mark, who was used to the world of public relations and carefully controlled narratives. But there was no easy explanation here. Keanu hadn't acted like a typical celebrity, and Mark couldn't ignore the feeling that there was something more to this story than met the eye. The plane touched down with a gentle thud, and the seatbelt sign blinked off. People began to gather their belongings, preparing to disembark. Mark stood up, stretching his legs, but still, he couldn't shake the lingering sense of unease. He looked over at Keanu again, who had already gathered his things, ready to leave. The way he moved was purposeful, yet calm, as though he had done this 1,000 times. As the crowd started to file out, Mark stood at the aisle, watching Keanu with an unsettling curiosity. And then, just as Mark was about to step off the plane, something unexpected happened. A man in a black suit appeared in the aisle, standing just a few feet away from Keanu. Mark couldn't help but notice the way the man's presence seemed to demand attention. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried an air of authority that was unmistakable. The two exchanged a brief glance, and it was clear from their interaction that they knew each other. Mark's eyes widened. Was this someone from Keanu's team? A bodyguard, perhaps? But the way the man looked at Keanu, it didn't feel like a typical celebrity-handler relationship. It was something more intense. Without a word, the man in the black suit handed Keanu a small envelope, something Mark couldn't see. Keanu took it without hesitation, slipping it into his jacket pocket. The exchange was smooth, almost practiced, and Mark felt a rush of confusion flood over him. What was in that envelope? Why had it been so secretive? The entire scene felt like something out of a movie, but this was real life, real and confusing, and Mark was right in the middle of it. Before Mark could make sense of what he had just witnessed, Keanu turned and walked toward the exit, the man in the black suit trailing behind him. The crowd parted to make way for them, and Mark, still standing in the aisle, felt a strange sense of urgency. Something was happening here, something much bigger than he had ever anticipated. And just when he thought he might finally understand the connection, the truth, the one piece of the puzzle that had eluded him, would remain just out of reach, leaving him with more questions than answers. To be continued. As Mark stepped off the plane, his mind was racing. The scene with the man in the black suit still replayed in his head. It wasn't just the secrecy of the exchange that disturbed him. It was the weight of it. There was a hidden layer to Keanu's world that Mark hadn't understood, and he was beginning to feel like an outsider looking in, someone who had stumbled onto a mystery far beyond his understanding. He wasn't sure what had just transpired, but he could feel in his gut that it was far from ordinary. The terminal was bustling with passengers retrieving their luggage, hurrying to their next destinations, yet Mark's steps felt slow, heavy. He couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was unfolding, something that he was now a part of, whether he wanted to be or not. He glanced around, half expecting to see Keanu again, but the actor and his companion had already disappeared into the crowd. Mark stopped by the baggage claim, his eyes darting around, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about the strange encounter, about the way Keanu had looked at him during their brief exchange. There was something different about him, something that went beyond the famous face or the calm demeanor. Keanu wasn't just an actor on a plane. There was a quiet force to him, an intensity that Mark couldn't quite comprehend. Was he just a regular guy trying to go home, as he had said? Or was there something more to him, something hidden beneath the surface? As Mark waited for his luggage, a thought crossed his mind, something that had been lingering ever since Keanu had made his cryptic comment. What if Keanu wasn't just another Hollywood star? What if there was more to him, something that tied into the mystery surrounding the envelope? Something that made him a target or a player in a bigger game? Mark's phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out, expecting to see a message from his assistant or a work-related email. But what he found instead was a text from an unknown number. It was short, cryptic. "We need to talk. Meet me at the usual place. 8 p.m. sharp." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. Who was this? And why did they think he would know where to meet them? The message was strange, unsettling, and yet there was something oddly familiar about it. He had a nagging feeling that this was tied to what had happened on the plane. Was it possible that Keanu was connected to this? That this was part of something much larger than he had ever imagined? Despite his hesitation, Mark knew he couldn't ignore the message. He had to go. If there was even a chance that it could shed light on the mystery. He had no choice but to follow through. The last few days had already taken a turn he hadn't expected, and the deeper he dug, the more complicated it seemed to get. At precisely 8 p.m., Mark found himself standing outside a dimly lit cafe in the heart of the city. He had been here before many years ago, when his business dealings were more underground and less refined. This was a place where whispers of secrets floated in the air, where people like him, people who dealt in things better left unsaid, could gather without drawing attention. It wasn't the kind of place he would have picked now, but the message had been clear. He had no choice. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The warm, musty smell of old coffee and cigarette smoke hit him immediately. The cafe was nearly empty, save for a few people sitting in the back corners, speaking in low tones. He spotted the person he was supposed to meet almost immediately, a woman sitting alone at a table by the window. She looked up as he approached, her face partially hidden in the shadows, but Mark recognized her instantly. Her name was Elena, a name that brought a mix of memories and caution to his mind. Elena was someone who had been a part of his past, a past he had tried to leave behind. "Elena," he greeted, his voice more guarded than he intended. She gave him a small smile, though there was something cold in her eyes. "I see you got my message." Mark nodded, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. "What's this about, Elena? I thought we were done with this world." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. "We're never done, Mark." "Not really. The world we're in doesn't let us walk away so easily." Mark shifted uncomfortably. He knew exactly what she meant. The world of secrets, of under-the-table deals and shadows that followed you no matter how far you ran. It was a world that could swallow you whole if you weren't careful. And for the first time in a long while, Mark felt himself slipping back into it, whether he liked it or not. "I'm not sure I understand," he said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Why am I here? What does this have to do with Keanu?" Elena raised an eyebrow. "You think it's just a coincidence that you ended up sitting next to him on that flight? That you overheard all of that? No, Mark, this is much bigger than you think." Mark leaned back in his chair, trying to absorb what she was saying. "You're saying Keanu's involved in this? What exactly?" She hesitated for a moment, glancing around the cafe before lowering her voice. "Keanu Reeves isn't just an actor. He's a key player in something that's been in motion for a long time. And the envelope he received, it's part of a much larger operation. An operation that's about to reach a tipping point. You're tangled in it now, whether you want to be or not." Mark's heart raced. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Keanu Reeves, a man who had seemed so harmless, so ordinary on the flight, was involved in something that had the power to shake the foundations of everything Mark knew. Didn't make sense. How could it be true? "What kind of operation are you talking about?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena didn't answer immediately. She took a deep breath, as if weighing how much to reveal. I can't tell you everything, not yet. But I can tell you this. Keanu is a lot more than he lets on. He's been working with people you don't know. People with connections. High-level connections. And that envelope he got. It's more than just a message. It's a signal that something big is coming. Mark was silent for a moment, trying to process it all. What do you want from me? She stared at him, her eyes intense. I need you to stay close. Watch Keanu. Watch everything. Because whatever happens next, it's going to change everything. And with that, the tension in the room deepened. And Mark realized that the mysterious world he had just been thrust into was far more dangerous and complex than he could have ever imagined. To be continued. The silence between Mark and Elena stretched on, thick with unspoken tension. Mark's mind raced as he tried to process everything she had just told him. Keanu Reeves, a man who had once seemed like just another celebrity, was now entangled in a web of secrets and shadowy operations that Mark could barely comprehend. Elena's warning echoed in his head. Stay close. Watch Keanu. It felt like a game, but not one that Mark had ever signed up for. The world he had tried to leave behind was pulling him back in, and there was no way to escape it now. But how far did this go? What was the end game? Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he was being led deeper into a labyrinth with no clear exit, and the walls were closing in around him. After their brief meeting, Elena disappeared just as quickly as she had appeared. Mark was left alone in the cafe, the air heavy with the weight of her words. He tried to clear his head, but there was no way to ignore the sense of urgency that gnawed at him. He had to find answers, and fast. The next few days felt like they stretched on forever. Mark kept his distance from Keanu, but it wasn't easy. Everywhere he went, there were whispers about the actor. News outlets buzzed with speculation about Keanu's next project, his sudden reclusive nature, and the cryptic appearance of the man in the black suit. But Mark knew better. He knew this was bigger than a PR stunt. Something was happening and he had to be ready. Mark began following Keanu's every move, though he made sure to stay under the radar. He knew he couldn't confront the actor outright. Elena's warning was still fresh in his mind. Keanu was connected to people, powerful people, who played a different kind of game. But as the days passed, Mark started to notice odd things. Keanu seemed to be in more places than one person could possibly be. There were reports of him being spotted at charity events, quiet dinners, and high-profile meetings, but no one could quite pin down what he was actually doing. It was like he was everywhere, and yet no one knew anything about him. The tension in Mark's chest grew tighter each day. He began to question everything. His role in this tangled mess, Elena's motivations, even his own judgment. The more he tried to follow the trail, the more elusive it became. Every time he thought he had a lead, it slipped through his fingers. And all the while, Keanu remained an enigma. Then one night everything changed. Mark had received another text, this one even more cryptic than the last. Tonight. Meet me at the pier. 2 a.m. Bring nothing. No name. No explanation. It was just enough to send Mark's pulse racing, knowing that this was the moment. He didn't hesitate. He couldn't afford to. If Keanu was involved in whatever game Elena had hinted at, then this was his chance to uncover the truth. The pier was dark and nearly deserted when Mark arrived. The only sound the soft crash of waves against the posts. A cold mist rolled in from the water, obscuring the view. The only light came from the distant street lamps and the occasional flicker of a passing car. Mark pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders, the chill of the air seeping into his bones. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, maybe a confrontation, maybe a revelation, but whatever it was, it felt like the end of the road. He paced back and forth, anxiety gnawing at him. His phone remained silent. No sign of anyone. For a moment, he considered leaving, wondering if it had all been some kind of trap. But then, just as doubt began to take root, a figure appeared at the far end of the pier. Mark's heart skipped a beat. Keanu. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The actor moved toward him with a steady, purposeful stride. His face half-shadowed in the mist. He looked different somehow. There was an intensity to him now, a focused energy that Mark hadn't seen before. It was as if the man who had sat next to him on that flight was gone, replaced by someone else, someone with a purpose that Mark couldn't understand. Keanu stopped a few feet away from Mark and stood there, silent for a moment. Then, without warning, he spoke. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and steady, but with an edge of something Mark couldn't place. Mark didn't move, his mind racing. "You've been involved in something. Something big. I need to know what it is, Keanu. I can't let this go." Keanu's expression didn't change. He didn't look angry, but there was something calculating in his gaze, as though he were sizing Mark up, weighing his next move. "You don't understand the consequences," he said slowly. "This isn't just about you or me. It's bigger than you think." Mark took a step forward, ignoring the warning in Keanu's voice. "What do you mean? What's bigger? You've been playing a part in something for a long time, haven't you? What's the real story behind the envelope?" Keanu's eyes flickered briefly, and Mark thought he saw a hint of something. Regret, maybe. But it was gone as quickly as it came. "You've seen too much already. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Mark's frustration boiled over. "I'm not leaving until I get some answers. I don't care who you're working with or how deep this goes. I want to know the truth." Keanu took a step back, his gaze never leaving Mark's. "The truth. There are things you can't unsee once you know them. There are things you won't want to know. But if you're determined to push, I'll show you." Mark's pulse quickened. He had pushed him this far, and now there was no turning back. But even as Keanu turned toward the shadows, signaling that he was about to reveal something, Mark couldn't shake the growing feeling that this was exactly what Elena had warned him about. Something bigger than both of them, something dark and dangerous, that was now on the verge of exploding. The air was thick with anticipation as Keanu led Mark deeper into the mist, toward an unknown destination. What lay ahead, Mark couldn't yet understand, but one thing was clear. Everything was about to change. To be continued. Mark followed Keanu through the fog, his footsteps muted by the damp wooden planks of the pier. The air was thick with anticipation, but Mark couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was being led into a trap. Every instinct in him screamed to stop, to turn around and leave, but curiosity, and the need for answers, pushed him forward. Keanu moved with purpose, his silhouette just barely visible in the mist. He didn't look back, didn't say a word, as though he knew Mark would follow him no matter what. The deeper they went into the fog, the heavier the silence became. Mark could barely make out the outlines of nearby boats, their masts swaying gently in the breeze. The world felt empty, isolated. It was as if they were the last two people left on Earth, walking toward some unknown destination. Just as Mark was about to ask Keanu what he meant by "things you won't want to know," a sound broke the stillness, an engine, distant but growing louder. It was the unmistakable hum of a boat's motor, but there was something off about it. Mark's heart raced as the sound grew nearer, and for the first time, he realized just how far from the shore they had gone. Keanu finally stopped, his back still to Mark, his eyes scanning the horizon. He seemed to be waiting, but for what? Mark's gaze darted around, trying to see anything through the thickening mist. There was no sign of the boat, no clue as to where it was coming from or who was behind it. And then it appeared. A sleek black boat, cutting through the water with alarming speed, emerged from the fog like a shadow. Its engine roared, echoing through the quiet night, as it pulled up to the pier with practiced precision. Mark's breath caught in his throat as the boat came to a stop, its dark figure looming ominously in front of them. The boat's engine cut off, and in the eerie silence that followed, Mark felt a chill run down his spine. Something wasn't right. His mind raced, but before he could react, two men dressed in black suits stepped off the boat and onto the pier. They didn't speak a word but moved with a sense of authority that sent a cold shiver through Mark's entire body. Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't acknowledge them at all. Instead, he stood silently, as if this moment was routine, like he'd been expecting them all along. The men in black suits stood in front of him, their faces impassive, their eyes cold and unreadable. Mark instinctively took a step back, feeling more like an outsider than ever before. The taller of the two men finally spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "Mr. Reeves," he said, his tone respectful but firm. "We need to discuss the next steps." Mark's heart thudded in his chest. "Next steps?" he whispered, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. What was happening? Who were these men? What did they want with Keanu? Keanu turned to Mark, his eyes meeting his with an intensity that left Mark momentarily speechless. "I told you you don't understand what you're getting into," Keanu said, his voice almost sympathetic. "This goes beyond me." The men in black suits didn't wait for further conversation. Without another word, they moved swiftly, surrounding Mark and Keanu. One of them reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, metallic object, a device that looked almost like a communicator or tracker. Mark's pulse quickened as the man held it up, looking between Keanu and the device with a professional air. "We need to move quickly," the man said, his voice colder now. "You know what's at stake." Keanu nodded once, his face a mask of composure. "I know." Mark's mind raced. He tried to speak, but the words got stuck in his throat. What is this?" he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. The second man, shorter and stockier than the first, finally spoke. His gaze flicked to Mark, then to Keanu. "You're not supposed to be here, Mr. Ford," he said, his tone clipped. "This is beyond your pay grade." He stepped toward Mark, his presence imposing. "We've been watching you. Your involvement is no longer a choice." Mark's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about? I'm just a businessman." "I don't." The man cut him off, his eyes narrowing. "You've seen too much already. You're in it now. Whether you want to be or not." Before Mark could respond, the man turned toward Keanu again, his expression shifting to one of silent understanding. "We've handled worse, but there's no time to explain. The operation's in motion." Keanu took a deep breath, glancing once more at Mark. "You should have stayed out of this, Mark," he said, his voice quiet but laced with regret. "But you're already too deep." The tall man nodded, and the second one reached into his pocket, pulling out a small piece of paper. He handed it to Mark, his fingers cold against Mark's palm. The paper was blank, except for a string of numbers scrawled across it in a hurried hand. "Go to this address," the man said. "It's the only way out. And remember, we're always watching." With that, the two men turned and walked back toward the boat, their movements swift and precise. They didn't look back. Keanu for a moment stayed still, as if weighing his options. But then, just as the boat's engine revved to life once again, he turned toward Mark and spoke one last time. "You've crossed a line, Mark. There's no going back from here. But at least you'll understand soon enough." Mark watched as the boat disappeared into the fog, the sound of the engine fading into nothingness. He was left alone on the pier, the chill of the night air biting at his skin. His fingers clenched around the piece of paper, the numbers burning into his mind. He had no idea what he had just witnessed, but one thing was clear. Whatever this was, it was much bigger than anything he had ever imagined. And now he was in too deep. To be continued. Mark's hand trembled as he gripped the piece of paper, the numbers on it seeming to pulse with a strange significance. He stood alone on the pier, the boat long gone, the fog creeping in around him like an omen. His mind was spinning, the mystery surrounding Keanu, the men in black suits, and the cryptic message all weaving together into a knot he couldn't untangle. The urgency of the moment hit him again, and he knew that whatever was about to unfold was beyond his control. He turned away from the empty pier, the cold air biting into his skin. The address on the paper was clear, a warehouse on the outskirts of town. Mark didn't hesitate. He had no idea what he was walking into, but he couldn't stop now. If this was the only way to understand what had been happening, if this was the only way to get the answers he desperately needed, then he had no choice but to follow through. The drive to the warehouse felt like an eternity. Every street he passed, every turn he made, seemed to stretch the distance between him and the truth. His mind kept racing. What had Keanu meant? What was this operation that had been set in motion? And what role did he play in it? He couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his gut, the fear that he had already crossed a point of no return. As he pulled into the desolate parking lot of the warehouse, he noticed the place was eerily quiet. The large, looming structure stood in front of him, windows dark, the doors closed tight. There was no sign of life, no movement. Mark hesitated for a moment, wondering if he should turn back, but the pull of the unknown was too strong. He knew he had to finish this, even if it meant walking into a trap. He parked the car and got out, his footsteps echoing in the silence as he approached the entrance. The metal door to the warehouse was slightly ajar, just wide enough for him to slip through. He pushed it open, the hinges creaking loudly in the stillness. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, the air thick with dust and the smell of old machinery. His eyes strained to see anything in the dark corners, but all he could make out were shadows and crates piled high. Mark stepped further into the warehouse, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know who he was supposed to meet here, but the urgency in the men's voices on the pier had made it clear. Something was happening and he had to be a part of it. But the deeper he walked into the warehouse, the more he began to feel like he was the one being watched. A noise broke the stillness, a footstep behind him, followed by another. Mark froze, his senses on high alert. He turned quickly, but the person who stepped out from the shadows wasn't who he had expected. It was Keanu. Mark's breath caught in his throat. "You," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Keanu stepped forward, his face serious, almost somber. "I didn't want this to happen. But it's too late now." Mark's mind was reeling. Too late for what? What is going on here, Keanu? What are you involved in? Keanu didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something, a small black device. It looked like a communicator of some kind, and Mark's heart skipped a beat when Keanu held it up. "This," Keanu said, "is how it all started. But it's not just about me anymore. And it's not just about you." Mark's confusion deepened. "What do you mean?" Keanu glanced around, as though checking for someone. "There's a game at play here, Mark. A game that's been going on for years. And you," he paused, his gaze locking with Mark's, "you've been part of it from the start. The truth is, you've been a pawn in this entire operation without even knowing it." Mark's mind spun. "A pawn? You've got to be kidding me. I'm just a businessman, Keanu." "I don't." Keanu cut him off. "No, Mark. You're more than that. You were chosen. That envelope you saw on the plane wasn't just a message. It was a signal that the operation was reaching its endgame. And now, here you are at the final stage." Mark's thoughts were racing now, trying to piece everything together. Envelope. The men in black suits. Elena's cryptic warning. Keanu's odd behavior. It was all connected. But how? And why him? Before Mark could ask another question, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps. Keanu's face hardened as he turned toward the noise, then back to Mark. "It's them," he said, urgency in his voice. "They've found us." Mark's blood ran cold. "Who? What's happening?" Keanu moved quickly, his eyes scanning the warehouse. "It's the people who've been controlling everything. The ones who pull the strings. The ones behind the operation. And you." He paused again, taking a deep breath as if bracing himself. "You're the key. The whole operation is built around you." Mark's mind was a blur, but one thing was clear. The stakes had just escalated to a level he couldn't comprehend. The door behind them slammed open, and two figures stepped into the dim light, their faces masked and their movements precise. They didn't speak as they advanced toward Keanu and Mark, but the tension in the air was palpable. Keanu stepped in front of Mark, a protective stance, though it seemed clear that he knew this moment was inevitable. The figures stopped a few feet away from them, and the taller one reached into his coat, pulling out a small, sleek device that glowed faintly in the darkness. He held it up, and Mark's heart skipped a beat. It was a tracking device, and he was the one it was tracking. "They know where you are," the man said, his voice calm, almost indifferent. "It's too late to run now." Mark's breath caught in his throat. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but before he could fully grasp what was happening, the final twist hit him. Keanu, the man who had seemed like an ally, the one who had guided him through the darkness, suddenly stepped back. His eyes met Mark's, and for the first time, Mark saw something he hadn't noticed before, an almost imperceptible look of regret. "Keanu," Mark said, his voice trembling. "What's going on?" Keanu didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked toward the two figures, a look of resignation on his face. "I'm sorry, Mark, but I had no choice. They've had control over me all along. And now you're the one who has to take the fall." Mark's world tilted, everything crashing down around him as the reality of what had just happened hit him. Keanu, the man he had trusted, the one who had seemed so genuine, had been playing him all along. The operation wasn't over. It had just begun, and Mark was the one who would be left holding the pieces. To be continued. Mark stood frozen, the weight of Keanu's betrayal pressing down on him. He couldn't believe it. Everything that had led him to this moment, the plane ride, the cryptic messages, the meeting on the pier, had been part of a game he never fully understood. And now Keanu, the man who had been his guide through this dark, confusing maze, was walking away from him, aligning himself with the very forces Mark had tried to uncover. The two masked figures moved closer, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Mark felt trapped, the walls closing in on him. The glowing tracker in the man's hand was a constant reminder that there was no way out. He had been played, but what was he supposed to do now? "Keanu, why?" Mark's voice cracked, desperate for an explanation, but the actor didn't turn back. Instead, he spoke to the two figures, his voice steady, but with an underlying sadness that Mark couldn't quite place. "It's too late for him," Keanu said, his tone resigned. "He doesn't know how deep this goes. There's no way he can understand now." The man with the tracker stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over Mark with cold indifference. "You've seen enough," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "It's time to clean up the mess." The other figure, a woman this time, moved in to secure Mark's arms. Her grip was firm, unyielding. Mark struggled against it for a moment, but there was no use. He was outnumbered, and the sheer weight of the situation was overwhelming. Everything he had thought he knew, everything he had worked for, was now irrelevant. He was just another pawn in a game that had been orchestrated long before he'd ever stepped onto that flight. Mark's mind raced, searching for some way out, but the harsh reality was sinking in. The people who had been pulling the strings all along were in control, and he had nothing left to fight with. It was over. But then, something unexpected happened. Keanu, who had seemed so distant moments ago, paused. He turned slightly, his eyes meeting Mark's for the briefest of moments. It was a fleeting glance, but in it Mark saw something. Guilt, maybe? Or was it regret? Didn't make sense. Why would Keanu feel anything now? He had just sold Mark out. "Keanu!" Mark shouted again, his voice louder this time, pushing through the haze of confusion. "You don't have to do this. You don't have to be part of this anymore." Keanu's face remained unreadable. He didn't answer right away. But then, in a low voice, barely above a whisper, he spoke. "I didn't want it to go this far. But it's already done. There's no turning back now." The woman holding Mark tightened her grip, but Mark barely noticed. He was focused on Keanu, desperate to understand. "What do you mean? What have you done? You're not just another pawn. You're a part of this. You've always been a part of it." Keanu hesitated, then stepped closer, as if trying to bridge the distance between them one last time. "I was chosen long ago," he said, his voice filled with quiet intensity. "I never had a choice, Mark. I thought I could control it, thought I could help you, but it's bigger than you or me." Mark's chest tightened as the pieces of the puzzle slowly began to shift into place. This wasn't just a conspiracy or a shadowy organization. This was something much more insidious. Keanu had been pulled into a system so deep, so far-reaching, that even he couldn't escape it. And now Mark had become entangled in it too. The woman took another step forward, her grip unyielding. "We're done here," she said, her tone final. "It's time to go." Mark's heart raced. There had to be something he could do, some way to fight back, but the fog of confusion was clouding his thoughts. He could barely think straight. The only thing that was clear was that he was about to lose everything. His freedom, his life, and any hope of uncovering the truth. But then, just as all seemed lost, a new voice broke through the tension. "Hold it right there." Mark's head snapped up, and his pulse surged. The woman froze, her eyes flicking toward the sound of the voice. Keanu's expression didn't change, but the shift in the air was palpable. Mark's heart skipped a beat. That voice. It was Elena. Elena emerged from the shadows, her figure sharp and determined as she stepped into the dim light of the warehouse. Her presence cut through the room like a knife. Mark felt a surge of hope. How had she found him? And why was she here? "Elena," Mark breathed, his voice full of disbelief. Keanu didn't move, but his eyes darkened. "You shouldn't be here," he said, though there was no real anger in his voice, just a deep sense of inevitability. Elena didn't flinch. "I had to be here," she said, her voice firm. "Because Mark's not the only one you've been manipulating, Keanu." The woman holding Mark's arms took a step back, clearly thrown by Elena's sudden appearance. The tension in the air shifted as the two masked figures exchanged a look, uncertainty now creeping into their actions. Elena's presence was a game changer. For the first time in a long while, Keanu seemed caught off guard. "You don't get it," Keanu said, his voice strained like he was barely holding onto his control. "This isn't something you can just walk away from. It's too dangerous." Elena didn't back down. "Maybe it's too dangerous for you, Keanu. But it's not for Mark. He's not a pawn anymore. He's the key to stopping all of this." Keanu shook his head, his eyes flicking between Elena and Mark. "You don't understand. You're both in over your heads." But Elena was already moving. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small device, quickly pressing a button. The warehouse lights flickered, then dimmed, and for a split second, everything seemed to fall into place. The two masked figures froze, their hands twitching toward their weapons, but it was too late. With a sharp click, the warehouse doors burst open, and a team of security personnel poured in, surrounding the room. Elena had called in reinforcements, and Keanu's plan was falling apart in front of him. "You can't control everything, Keanu," Elena said, her voice steady, now filled with a quiet triumph. "Not anymore." The masked figures, realizing they were outnumbered, raised their hands in surrender. Keanu's shoulders slumped, the weight of his actions finally catching up with him. He turned toward Mark, his face full of regret. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low. "I never wanted to hurt you." Mark could hardly process what was happening. His mind was spinning, the truth finally emerging from the fog of confusion. The people who had been pulling the strings, the operation that had been set in motion, were all part of a much larger scheme. But now it was over. Keanu's role in the operation was finished. And Mark, he was free. As the security team took the two masked figures away, Elena stepped closer to Mark. "You're safe now," she said, offering him a reassuring smile. "It's all over." Mark didn't know what to say. He had been through so much in such a short time, and yet, for the first time, he felt like he could breathe again. The world he had been sucked into had collapsed, and now it was time to rebuild. Whatever the future held, he knew one thing for sure. He was in control of his own destiny. And as for Keanu, Mark wasn't sure what would become of him. The man who had once been his ally was now just another casualty of a game much larger than they had ever realized. But that was a story for another day. End.